Well, greetings, you curious, you courageous Herle Burly-ites. Hey, we've got a pretty cool show on tap for you today. It's one podcast sitting inside another podcast, kind of like a twofer or a really lazy Russian nesting doll. Here's what I mean. Air quotes media, the super smart and moderately attractive people who bring you the Herle Burly and the Curse of Politics, is launching a brand new pod in partnership with Mike McDonald, Kate Hammer, and Geoff Meggs. Hotel Pacifico is the name, and you guessed it, it's your weekly dose of what's going down in West Coast politics. Rather than me trying to explain more stuff, let me push play on the show trailer to give you all a sense of it.
Good day, fellow political traveler, and welcome to Hotel Pacifico. We're your 5-star podcast destination for BC politicos, rated number 1 by Stump Advisor. Looking for predictable party lines and all the same spin? Move on. There are no vacancies for you here. But if you want a port in the political storm, a vacation from the hot air, an hour of honesty, insight, and unspun West Coast politics and policy, Hotel Pacifico is absolutely the place for you. Each week, your stay at Hotel Pacifico includes Part 1. Your hosts, strategist and pollster Mike McDonald and award-winning former Globe and Mail journalist Kate Hammer, bring a guest into the hotel for an interview. Somebody famous, or not so famous, but always interesting, involved, and relevant to the BC scene. Part 2. Mike and Kate are joined in our strategy suite by Geoff Meggs, former chief of staff and current comms strategist, for a panel discussion and a breakdown of all the BC political happenings of the week. The Hotel Pacifico podcast. There's always room for you here, so check in anytime you like. BC, you can never leave.
So, we're pretty excited about that. You can find Hotel Pacifico on all your favorite podcast apps right now. So give it a follow or subscribe today. First episode starts next week. And today I'm talking to Kate, Mike, and Geoff, sort of like a Hotel Pacifico primer. More specifically, we'll cover what's happening in BC politics provincially, what's happening federally out there, and what is the special situation with opioids, drugs, and street crime that is making that such a big issue in Vancouver. Let's get right to it. Geoff, Mike, Kate, great to have you here. Great to see you and so excited about this new venture.
Yeah, we're pumped.
So
it's going to be great.
I mean, I take offense, moderately attractive. I mean, especially on Mike's behalf, I feel like we could get an upgrade, but glad to be here.
Oh, no, we weren't talking about you. We were talking about the Air Quotes team.
Air Quotes team.
We were talking about me. I dragged down the average pretty considerably. I mean, the thing is that BC politics is so neglected in national coverage of politics that this is unnatural.
Well, there's always something exciting going on in BC politics, as you know. And, this is a great opportunity 1 year from the next provincial election to drill down on some issues and also speak to an audience that I think hungry for content that's informed and sophisticated. And whether you're a staffer, an elected, or just someone who follows politics closely, we're hoping to entertain and inform.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, let's get at it. Go ahead, Kate.
I was going to say, I think we're all, Geoff, Mike, and I are all kind of all for creating more spaces where we can have real informed conversation, disagree, and continue to like each other through it. There just needs to be more of those types of spaces with less spin, more real talk. And I think, I was thinking about the pod in BC, and there's a lot of space in this province, I think, for this discussion. But I think the other thing that's kind of interesting for the rest of the country, I go back to a time when the newsroom was shrinking. I worked at the Globe and Mail, and there was always this tension with the Vancouver Bureau and the BC Bureau and how much attention we did get or didn't get and how much resourcing we didn't get. Fast forward to now, I was sort of looking back at all the policy pieces that started in BC and then got extrapolated to the country. And there's a lot of them that are really salient, like in this moment. And I'm thinking of $10 a day childcare and now the short-term housing policing or regulations. So it's interesting to me, why BC would be such a good place to start for a provincial pod, just because of the kind of policy questions we're like a policy think tank, a policy incubator so much for the country.
Well, I think from my standpoint, David, a lot of assumptions and well-established truths are being challenged right now and overturned. A lot of idols are falling. And the whole terrain is shifting around, and where that winds up, I think, is an open question. So it's a great time to start these kinds of discussions.
All right, Geoff, let me start with you. And you're the most recently successful person on this podcast, so you're my go-to. Something that's really fascinating me is happening out in BC provincial politics, and that is what's happening to the former BC Liberal Party. Right. And so what we see in polls in BC is a very comfortable lead for the NDP and EB. But we see in some polls the BC Liberals who rebranded as BC United, presumably for the purpose of heading off the Conservative Party, running tied with or behind the Conservatives and well behind the Liberals. So what is going on with the former BC Liberals, BC United?
Well, I'm sure that a lot of them are asking themselves that question.
I mean, they were tied with the NDP as recently as 2017, right?
Well, that's what I mean. And the NDP had the nightmare on the, I don't know if it's left or right, it depends on your standpoint, with the Green Party, where the NDP was only able to form power with under Horgan with confidence and supply agreement with the Green Party. And I would argue that as significant in some respects as the Conservative surge, which I'm sure we'll spend some more time on, is the collapse of the Green Party as a functional political force, and particularly with the departure of their leader, Andrew Weaver. They have a new leader, Sonia First, a capable, committed person, but he was really the franchise that led a lot of momentum. And they hit a wall during a by-election process and have actually never picked themselves back off the mat. So EB's got a strong situation on his flank. It's all good. He's got a majority, and according to Canada, or 338.Canada, he's a 99% bet to win even more seats if an election was held today, which is, for a New Democrat, kind of pinch yourself and pour another drink.
Right.
Well, I guess we can call it.
That's been a great podcast. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you very much. That wraps up 1 year of Hotel Pacifico programming.
You see it as potentially more competitive, Mike?
Well, I don't dispute with the fact that BC United's in a definite pickle. The rebranding has caused
Is it a pickle or a death spiral?
That's what I was going to say.
Well,
I hate those pickles.
Pickle seems soft. Pickle for what I'm seeing in the data.
It's hard to know right now. I mean, we've been in these situations before. I mean, parties have been in these situations before where it looks very bleak a year out, and politics is unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. But clearly the onus is on leader Kevin Falcon and the BC United team to fight their way out of this situation they're in, which in part is one they've created for themselves. The other is the fact that David Eby's off to a good year. I mean, he's had a good start to his premiership, and he's a good communicator. And so far, he's coasting on a Horgan legacy, frankly, of people feeling that the NDP aren't that scary under the Horgan administration, and credit to Geoff for that. And Eby's kind of picked up on that and, ensured there's still a kind of a moderate sheen to the NDP. But the United Party has to figure it out, and now they've got a serious situation on the right.
Rebrand a mistake, Mike?
I'll qualify that. I think the idea of a rebrand wasn't necessarily a mistake. I'm a longtime BC Liberal, obviously, practically in Liberal diapers when I was born. But if the BC Liberal brand was there today with Justin Trudeau in power as he is right now and very unpopular, it wouldn't be great either. It may be better, but I think it would be a leg on the party. And that might be something they could have fought through and got to the other side, because I think provincial voters are pretty sophisticated as they can separate BC Liberals from federal Liberals, but it always was an irritant internally and it was getting more so. But clearly going to BC United, it might have been the wrong brand. It didn't have any money behind it when it launched. So it was kind of went into a vacuum. And they've got a year to figure it out. It's, I don't think there's any going back at this point.
Right. Kate, what are these conservatives like? Why are they appealing to people?
Well, I think it's interesting to look at the challenge there about how people understand BCU and the Conservatives. like it's hard to carve out a space on that side, I think, in BC. And I think a really good example of that was how there was a big win for David Eby, I think earlier this month when John Rustad, when he officially became the fourth party and stood up in the House and made a comment about SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, right, in schools. And it was really easy for Eby to just press back and say, like, why are you asking this question? And then really awkward, particularly for BC United, and how to respond, right? Because then everyone stood up, the Greens and the NDP stood up to applaud Eby's response, pushing back and saying, how dare you pick on these kids? And I think BC United would say, that some of their members didn't stand when Eby responded because I believe the line was because they didn't want to applaud the premier. But I think even if you think that was the case, it just shows how difficult it is for these two parties to kind of like clear a space between each other. And so I think how much anybody understands one or the other is yet to be determined. And is exactly the reason why, we can cast a joke that like maybe it's a year before we need to come back on this discussion. Because for Eby, it makes the next, 12 months at least look pretty, they're his to lose.
Right. Are they positioned in a way, this conservative party, and just to expand on what Kate was saying, I mean, the BC United, the former BC Liberals, are themselves a form of a conservative party. So this is a party presumably even to the right of that entity. So my question is, it's gotten into the 20s, mid-20s of support level. How big can it get? Is it limited in its growth by how far to the right it is, or is it a possible actual replacement for the BC United? Sorry.
I personally don't think it is. Well, I'll jump in first, Geoff. Yeah, you can contradict me. I personally don't think it's a replacement for Free Enterprise Coalition lead party. I think they may be ahead in the polls right now. And in a worst case scenario for BC United, maybe BC Conservatives do get ahead of them in the next election. But that would be a Pyrrhic victory. Because I don't believe they have the ability to fashion a 40 to 45% slice of the electorate that you need to win a majority government in British Columbia. So they're troublemakers right now. They're on the ascendancy because they've got a brand that isn't confusing, and they have two members in the legislature, and they're off to the races. But they're very niche in some of the issues they're going after on the right, which have not historically been appealing to people in the suburbs or the urban areas. And so I don't see where their growth is, but Geoff, you may see it otherwise.
Well, the New Democrats are not unfamiliar with catastrophe, having reduced to 2 seats in 2001. So anything can happen. Kevin Falcon has just been hit by a 2x4 right across the forehead, coming, fourth or third in a recent by-election with a credible candidate. What he's got, so I don't know. I've never seen a crossover like that. Some of the troubles Justin Trudeau's had look like a walk in the park compared to falling off a cliff, losing an MLA. I think there's others who are clearly restive. However, to support your point, Michael, do they have money and professional staff who would come in and put discipline on this the way they did with Danielle Smith in Alberta? I'm not sure. I don't see that yet. Like just this week, Rustad was checking through a new piece of legislation to help communities face wildfire and other disaster by questioning why there was a reference to the United Nations in this. This is the so-called Sendai framework developed in Japan, where they know a bit about disasters, which has been globally recognized as a standard for resilience, of construction of infrastructure and so on. But Mr. Rustad's going to check back in his attic and see if there's actually some kind of global government being imposed here in BC. So that kind of, super marginal activity is good news for Kevin Falcon. But I think the problem for Mr. Falcon is that he's yesterday's man. He's out of a previous decade. He's playing with a playbook that you'll be familiar with, Mike. But I don't know that it's still relevant to the current time. And I think he's going to have to struggle with that because, as you say, he thought he had a perfect plan with a new name to shed that slimy liberal stuff that he had to carry around all those years in the Free Enterprise Coalition. Now he's going to make it in his own name and his own style. And John Rustad's got a different idea.
And Geoff, he was a conservative, right? He was never a federal liberal, Falcon.
That's my view. That's my understanding.
He was a conservative. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
In fact, most were. Kate,
But
Talk to me about
that's
EBK.
that's okay though. I mean, just on that point, like the BC Liberals as they were constituted, you're allowed to be a conservative, you're allowed to be a liberal.
Yeah, no. I'm just. Yeah.
But in fact,
he was not. He was particularly disinclined to carry around Trudeau's water, I presume.
well, the space he's in today is that BC. I mean, I think he recognized when he became leader, he had to push to the center. He had to position the party, and it's an old Nixon goes to China thing, where I think they thought Kevin could push to the center because the conservative flank would be okay with Kevin Falcon, and that part I think is surprising that that's not okay. So I think he still has to push to the center, but he's got to do it through policy, and he's got to do it through being a relentlessly hard opposition on this government. It's not like there isn't any issues to prosecute. There's tons of issues and weak spots this government has, but they just gotta turn it around. What can I say?
What does the inexorable march of digital transformation have to do with helping Canada meet its climate goals? That's a question we've explored here before, Herle Burly-ites. On behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Short answer, a hell of a lot. I can hear you whispering, they're a technology company, Herle. They've got skin in the game and they sponsor your damn pod. True that. So here's some compelling third-party validation. Accenture, the global strategy and consulting firm, regularly reports on the economic and environmental benefits of 5G in Canada. They've just released a report on the power of digital transformation and connectivity, and how it helps us meet our climate goals set out by the Paris Agreement. How are we doing on those? Reality check. We've only reduced emissions by 9% toward those Paris commitments. So the report presents a myriad of suggestions to help industries digitally transform and lower their greenhouse gases. The biggest and most impactful? Using connected devices to make processes more efficient and operations simpler. Here's just one example from the agricultural industry. Automated crop monitoring and sensors that reduce water and fertilizer use by 20 to 40%. On the enterprise side, a shift to the cloud not only makes resource management far more accurate and efficient, it'll lower greenhouse gas emissions of traditional data centers by 98%. That's a nice thought. All of this requires investment, of course. It takes a whole whack of money to build out world-class networks that can support this kind of digital infrastructure. Well, TELUS is here for it. Earlier this year, they announced a more than $81 billion investment into infrastructure operations and spectrum. They want to speed the digital transformation that'll help Canada reach its climate goals. Oh, you know what else it takes, Herle Burly-ites? Support from government and a legislative and regulatory environment that continues to make those investments make sense. All right, well, let's spend at least a minute on the party with a 99% chance of winning. Kate, what is working so well for EB? I mean, this is not an easy time to be in government, whether at any level. All the same pressures that are buffeting Trudeau are buffeting every provincial government, the affordability question, housing issues, etc. So is it just that there's no acceptable alternative, or does EB have something going?
That's a great question. And I'd say, yeah, it's not an easy time to be in government. It's not an easy time to be in government leading as a progressive leader at a time when people more and more are going to be looking for those kind of traditional manage the economy bona fides that always advantage more right-leaning parties. And then the other interesting piece for David Eby is, following the act of John Horgan, who in that kind of persona of a left-leaning politician, right, had more of that folksy kind of working guy vibe that works really well often, for more progressive left-leaning politicians. And Eby, I think, casts more of something that gets criticized, more of that kind of downtown elite. He's a lawyer. He represents Point Grey. Pardon me. There's just a bunch of reasons why I think looking back on this transition, I don't know many people would have predicted that it would be going as well as it has for Eby. I'm going to say a couple things, that I would look at to think maybe what are things that he's done really well that are part of why it's working. He came out really strong and really clear that he was going to push on housing, and many others have done that. That's not new. what I would point to is kind of a really interesting constellation of a combination of things. Going to name one that he got a lot of slack for, like writing to the Bank of Canada and saying, keep the interest rates low. And you can say, sure, and be absolutely right that there's no relationship between the two things. But in terms of showing you're serious and laying the pavement,
I was impressed. That showed a populist instinct on his part, which I wasn't sure he had, right?
Exactly. And so it's interesting because I think you can contrast things like the move they're doing now on Airbnb, right? And actually the sort of fantastic tangibility of the housing that frees up. I mean, it's a really a 1-2 punch. And there's some other things. I mean, I was thinking back to just recently to sort of when he first, we're about a year in, right? When he first became premier, and there was, even in his own riding, there was an issue around some really litigious residents holding up a development sort of on the edge of his riding near Kitsilano, and came in strong there. And again, you could sort of say it's 40 units getting built in Kitsilano, not the biggest thing, but I think he's been pretty consistent in building the pavement, building the sort of groundwork to be able to say, I'm serious on housing, and then to come out with something like the really tangible, like the Airbnb regulation and the short-term housing regulation that is so popular. We now have the feds looking at it saying we want to do it too. That's a really critical win for him with a set of voters who are going to be critical to him in the next election.
So that's policy stuff. Do people like him, Mike? People like him?
Well, I think his favorables are pretty good. He's definitely net favorable. He's definitely in the strongest position among the leaders. I don't think the public know him very well at this point, but so far, as I said earlier, he's I think coasting a bit on the Horgan Express train here. That set a political climate for him that was pretty favorable to walk into. But since he's become premier, I think it was last December, he's kept a good tone. And I've seen him live in a few events, big venues like the Union of BC Municipality convention a couple of weeks ago. And he eschewed the usual speak for 45 minutes and make lots of announcements. He spoke for maybe 15 and took questions. And he's good in that venue. Like, he's relatable. He's got a good tone. He can be disarming. So, there's a lot politically to like about David Eby if you just look at it objectively as a political practitioner. I think the devil is in the details, and some, as his record gets longer, where are the results? The fiscal situation's worsening. It's still very unaffordable out here. There's still lots of issues with housing. There's a lot of talk that he's brought forward that people like, but what's going to be the result of that at the end of the day? That's the question.
Okay, last word on provincial politics. Geoff, if Eby hits a speed bump on the way to re-election, what is that likely to be?
I think it could be the economy in some fashion as it relates to affordability, something that he arguably should have some control over, but actually does not. I mean, the perennial one out here is gas prices. They spike up, they're higher. There's vulnerabilities perhaps in the fact, although carbon tax has been a bipartisan policy for almost a generation here. It was started by Gordon Campbell. But carbon tax and climate initiatives are contributing significantly to gas prices. There's no argument there. And the public is more interested in being protected from forest fires and floods than actually thinking that they're doing something in somebody's computer model to bring down GHG emissions. So I think there may be some challenges there. Huge infrastructure projects in this province that help the economy are going to be coming to a conclusion, be finished in the next 12 months, 3 or 4 huge ones, Site C, 2 pipeline projects, the LNG terminal, and those, there's nothing immediately behind them. So we could see a number of things, as Mike says, on the economic front that may be challenging.
All right, let's switch to the federal scene and what's going on federally in British Columbia. And British Columbia latterly has become important to forming governments in Canada. So you don't anymore turn on the TV to find out what the shape of the government is. You're part of shaping the government. My read of the polls, Kate, is that the Conservatives are looking very strong and the Liberals are likely to lose a lot of seats out there. Is that your read? And if so, why? What's going on?
I think there's a few things at play, particularly in Surrey, which is really the big part of the map that I think the Liberals need to continue to get the votes, the seats they need out of BC to form government. There's a couple though, I don't know if I'd quite simply say it's erosion of Liberal vote here, because I think it's interesting, Surrey in particular has kind of bucked against the trend over the last couple of federal elections. So if you look at the vote in Surrey between 2019, 2021, it actually went up for the Liberals. And one thing that I'm wondering about is, particularly for an area like Surrey, is we have these really interesting dynamics at play with particularly the recent the conflict with Modi, right? And the recent murder of a Canadian citizen, a Sikh leader, right, in Surrey on Canadian soil. And I think what's interesting is what that does, I think, in terms of activating voters is really hard to tell. And again, makes me wonder if Surrey is going to look a little bit different than the overall trend. That said, a lot of those things that are hurting Trudeau right now in this moment play particularly hard in BC. So those affordability cries and that sort of impatience on, moving on the housing file and everything else is particularly acute here. So broadly, yes. But again, it's just always that thing in politics, particularly federal politics, where how that plays out with the electoral map is really actually what the prognosis is going to be for the next election.
Mike, Justin Trudeau is the most successful Liberal leader in British Columbia in modern Canadian history. And he has had a seemingly special relationship with the people of BC since he's been the leader of the Liberal Party. What's happening to that?
Well, I think there's it's strained, reflective of the national direction, I think. But I think they're picking up on Kate's piece about Surrey. I mean, I think there's kind of three clumps of ridings out here that the Liberals, hold. One's City of Vancouver, which they remain fairly strong. There might be some vulnerability in Vancouver South, but generally they've been pretty strong in the city still, I think. Surrey is a new phenomena, and it's kind of Fortress Surrey for them. And that's built a lot around the South Asian support. And I think that may well be very resilient.
Is that why Harjit Sajjan is still in the cabinet?
Well, he's a Vancouver MP. I'm not sure how germane he is to their hopes in Surrey, but I think South Asian representation generally in cabinet is important to maintain the diaspora support there. But it's the seats outside of Surrey and Vancouver that I think they're especially vulnerable. Delta, Burnaby, Coquitlam, North Shore, which are more suburban in nature and not as and Richmond. Some have a lot of Chinese voters, but some are just generally suburban seats. And I think those are the ones that the Conservatives are going to be locking in on. Richmond was kind of a special situation last time because of the Chinese dynamics around the Conservative vote. And there's no doubt that Richmond seats bucked the trend last time as well. So, I think the Liberals out here, it's not like when you and I were coming up the ranks, David, in the 80s, where it was like you couldn't find a Liberal west of Winnipeg. And now they have a stronger base out here for sure. And that's reflective, I just think, of the evolution of, demographics and things like that. But, Poilievre's on the march, and Poilievre probably has opportunity on NDP seats as well on Vancouver Island, where they're more resource-based. They're not very diverse seats. And to me, that's a place where if I were Conservatives, I'd be looking at places like North Island, Comox, Alberni, and Cowichan Valley.
Yeah, Geoff, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, all across the country, Poilievre seems to be hunting working-class NDP voters more than he's even hunting Liberal voters right now. And how is that project going for him in British Columbia? Because a declining Liberal vote should theoretically create opportunities for the NDP.
Well, I think it's going very well for him. And I think, my party's underestimated this threat to some extent because for various reasons, people in blue-collar resource sector industries, and there's still significant numbers of families like that in BC, are looking for very straight, quote-unquote, common sense solutions, people who speak directly to the issues they face. But just an interesting kind of a sidebar on how this plays both in the provincial and federal zone. a guy named Aaron Gunn with a colossal sort of alt-right social media following was actually rejected as a possible leadership candidate when Kevin Falcon was seeking the leadership a year or so ago. Rolled straight into North Island, in Vancouver Island, and is going to get the nomination there. I'm absolutely certain of it. Rachel Blaney, the New Democrat, I think has got a big problem on her hands. Poilievre has been spending a ton of time out here. He was at the big shipyard to the North Shore. I'll just say this too about when I look across Canada and I see Francois Philippe Champagne or a Chrystia Freeland or a number of the other larger figures on the Liberal front bench in Ontario and Quebec, I don't see that here. And I don't say that to disparage anybody, but we don't have a senior political figure in the front bench of the Liberal administration who can really do that job and channel why somebody should give a damn about Justin Trudeau's future. I've always thought that Justin Trudeau had a better relationship with BC than BC thought it had with him. Mike may disagree with that, but it's certainly a.
What do you mean by that? Expand on that just a little bit.
Well, he lived here. He taught here. He had a family connection through his mother, but he was never a personality in public life in BC. He's not someone who came up through any ranks. Right. And so he polishes that connection just the way many politicians polish the fact that my mom was a single mom or whatever it was. And it's true. And that may be important to you and kind of ring a bell when you're making the stump speech. But does anybody in BC think, well, it's a good thing we got Trudeau there, like they may in Quebec think, well, it's a good thing we got a francophone. I think he's seen more as a Montreal guy, honestly.
Well, as they say in Westeros, winter is coming. And I'm going to make a little prediction here. After we get slammed by that first wall of snow and ice, some of us will be wandering around Canadian Tire, asking the guy in the red shirt if there are any snow shovels left, and maybe a couple of bags of salt. And there won't be. Because you got to have a plan. Our sponsor, CN, has a plan. How's that for a segue? Anyway, they do. They have an official winter plan just published. Why? Because when you're responsible for keeping the Canadian economy moving, having an actual plan is good business. How bad this winter will be is still anyone's guess. But listen to this. 2 years ago, CN had to deal with temperatures below minus 30 for more than 50 of 65 days. That kind of cold attacks brake hoses, tracks, and wheels. Trains must be shortened. Last year wasn't a lot kinder. And then there are a slew of new and looming government regulations. Interswitching, a system that allows shippers to force railways to deliver cargo to each other, will absolutely result in delays. The federal government intends to introduce labor legislation that will in all likelihood result in more and longer-lasting strikes. In May, new federal rules increased paid sick days and drastically shortened maximum shift times. As a result, railways will have to hire more people in the midst of a labor shortage to move the same amount of cargo. Winter and all its attendant inefficiencies will further slow supply chains. Make no mistake. Yes, trains must move, no matter what the hurdles, or the economy shudders and stops. CN just wants its stakeholders to know there are heavy new headwinds.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Kate, Kate, who's the Liberals' most effective political minister in BC?
Well, that's Jonathan Wilkinson.
Okay.
Certainly the most senior, right? And has been really present, I think, in this cabinet, leading on, the climate file and from different ministries. And I think, though, I have heard people, wonder, why is he not more present here? We don't see him, as regularly in BC as I think some people would like to see him, particularly if he's going to be sort of the banner holder for this government and this side of the country. That's something I think he spoke recently. We have a sort of convention every year, UBCM, of all the municipal provincial leaders tend to gather in one space. And Jonathan Wilkinson was there, but gave a pretty, lukewarm traditional greeting, not the kind of barn burner you might expect from someone who's holding up the banner a year out from an election for a critical province for the government.
You're being very polite.
What do you think? What do you think, Mike?
Well, be very polite about this speech.
Take,
I mean, Jonathan, let me set the scene, David. You got 1,000 elected leaders in a hall, and everyone around that's part of the political intelligentsia in British Columbia. And the minister Wilkinson goes up to the stage and gives the most absolutely wooden, robotic speech one could imagine, written fresh off the printer from the government communications officer. I'm sure the way it sounded. There was no message. There was no call as to why the government's on their side, why the government's aligned with their interests. It was just a very bland. Look, they mailed it in. And I'm thinking like, geez, these guys, they're in the fight of their lives here. And Jonathan is a very strong minister, reputed to be very strong in the cabinet room, all that kind of stuff, big brain. But he's got political responsibilities. And you need your lead minister to do more. And it's a problem that this government has in terms of enabling their lead ministers to go and play that role as well. Very centralized government. So they have to do better. And that in particular case was a pretty striking example of they're not in election footing.
I would say this is a very kind of insidery version of governmentitis, but it's interesting because I think if you are a Politico, and you know Jonathan Wilkinson and see him and understand him, and if you're not, if you're an average person who follows politics federally and provincially a little more lightly, you're not seeing him the way you would expect.
How is this, to pick up on something Geoff said a little while ago, how is this climate change, carbon tax, affordability conflict going out in BC? I mean, if the Liberals can't run on the fucking carbon tax in the Lower Mainland, they might as well just pack it in. But can they run on the carbon tax in the Lower Mainland?
Well, I think it would be unwise to run on that, but I don't think they need to worry about it as a core issue in the same way. What they face here is, as Mike and Kate pointed out, is a really tough attack from Poilievre, who's spending a ton of time talking about issues that they're too worn out and too exhausted to come to grips with, whether it's housing affordability or whatever it is. I feel there's a real oomph in the conservative approach, and how does this stuff play in BC? Well, it plays as part of Western Canada, where you see the conservative intellectual machinery, the political staffers, the activists, and so on are really feeling great and smelling blood. And on the other side, you have a Trudeau Liberal administration, at least from a BC standpoint, that, as others have said more eloquently than me, is really rudderless from a provincial perspective. And I think we could all name people who wouldn't be known to other Canadians, but were big deals in terms of making sure Jean Chrétien had good support in BC and that kind of thing. I don't know who those people are anymore. And
Ross Fitzpatrick, you're talking about, people like that.
Oh yeah, or Prem Vinning, people like that in various communities. Yeah. Very, very redoubtable organizers and highly respected in the community. And undoubtedly they're there, but I just have no idea who they are. And to Kate and Mike's point about Jonathan, yeah, he is sort of seen as the person, but there's not a lot of there someplace. And he's got a brutally policy heavy, explanation heavy kind of portfolio. And I contrast.
That's because he used to be one of yours, Geoff.
Yeah.
Right. He's a former New Democrat, right? That's why he loves to talk about policy ad nauseum.
I know. Well, it took harder to shake us with a lot of that. But I would just point to Jean-François Champagne again, who's been in billions and billions and billions of dollars of announcements in two provinces delivering battery plants, whether they're a good idea or not. We don't have that here. So, that we don't have anybody like that. We don't have that happening here. And I think that's a problem.
And frankly, nor have we tended to care as well. Sure. Like BC hasn't been that parochial about those types of things, maybe to our detriment. But I still think it's important that the federal government announces its presence.
Well, we could have done, to the point of it, Wilkinson could do things like the grid we've been talked about for 6 years, electrify the grid, do more about hydrogen, just some bells and whistles, some stuff you could touch and feel and go, hey, yeah, there is going to be renewal in the economy to support climate change. But I don't see those announcements.
Kate, it feels to me like a lot of the Liberal hope for re-election is built around an unacceptability of Poilievre, built around a belief that when push comes to shove, people will recoil from Poilievre or from the party and some of the more extreme elements. Do you see any evidence of that in the first year of Poilievre's leadership?
I mean, since he got rid of the glasses, maybe it's harder to stick. I think it's been interesting because I would completely agree with that assessment. And I was, recently in Ottawa talking with some friends, working on this. And that really is, in summary, the strategy. And I wouldn't say without reason. I think there is space for Pierre Poilievre. I think he has a brand that is really effective in opposition, and that's been shown. I mean, that sort of complain, rail, do a YouTube video, stand in front of the too expensive house kind of vibe, I'll call it. But when you turn that around to, okay, let's give you the keys to the car, I think it might start to look a little bit different. So I don't know that it's, I think there's some good reason for that. Have we seen any evidence that it's working? Absolutely not. Because I would say to the degree to which the Liberals can make that case that Poilievre's kind of that guy, that, that uncle at the Thanksgiving table who says the thing you didn't want anyone to say and made everyone feel awkward. Like the degree to which they can paint that.
Normally my role.
The degree to which they can paint that remains grossly outshadowed by the kind of Laurentian elite problem that they have, out of touch, disingenuous kind of labels that are getting thrown at their leader, Justin Trudeau. And so, I think that's kind of the problem for them. The degree to which you can kind of see a possible path on how you label Poilievre really needs to be weighed against the reality of how much you can do to rehabilitate the understanding of your own leader. And the two are just not, they're on very different scales at this point.
Right. Geoff, Mike, you see Poilievre cleaning up his vulnerabilities?
Well, I was on your show with Geoff last year or whenever it was, and I said that I thought Poilievre had a high floor and a low ceiling. And, I'm going to have to reconsider that. And I think part of it is he is going outside the traditional left-right continuum and reaching out to those NDP voters and those working class voters.
They have a strategy.
Yeah. And, and he doesn't care. Like, they don't care what people say about them. And I think there's strength in that approach. I mean, it's a ballsy approach. But when it comes to the RIP period, and then all of the people are protesting loudly about all the dangerous things Poilievre is going to do, I think he's building a shield for himself right now. And it's an approach we're not used to. And but it may serve him well when he gets to the RIP period. And the other part is that there's a time when the public's just ready to throw government out, and regardless of who the opposition is. So that's where, not only the Liberals have their challenges in government, the NDP are joined at the hip. So the Conservatives really have a free ride on the opposition side. That the NDP aren't splitting the protest vote.
I have never seen a political operation so utterly dismissive of earned media as the Poilievre operation.
Yeah. And they're at this point, they don't seem to be paying a price for that.
Like, they are totally unafraid of what the Toronto Star says about them. Go ahead, knock yourself out. I could care less.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Well, I watched the feed, and they produce their own earned media daily with, Poilievre standing around with groups of people setting up the shots. They're controlling the imagery, and it's got a authentic and a contemporary feel to it. And to say a word in defense of the Prime Minister, I think Paul Wells put it well. And you think about the human beings involved. We've all been involved around politicians, and Trudeau has a work ethic which just makes me wilt watching him fly around the world, do these meetings. I don't think he has much choice. His staff have to send him to these things. I mean, that's what the Prime Minister does. But also to go through a marriage breakdown, some of the difficulties with the fires, the emotional drain on someone dealing with emergencies like that, or the Khalistan situation, it's just over the top. And at the end of a third term, who knows? Like, I think, to be fair to Trudeau and his team, it's been an unbelievable period in terms of political challenges. Poilievre doesn't have to worry about any of that. He just sends out his people with a terrific little, with their video cameras, and they catch him doing what he's doing better and better and better, which is just hang out with people and agree that life sucks, and probably Trudeau's the reason. And, I think it's working very well for him, and it's a very dangerous time for anyone to be seen to be kind of out of touch. And it's hard to be in touch when you're dealing with foreign affairs, you name it.
Right. Geoff, can I stick with you for just a second and ask you, because you've had some experience with the minority situation, when should the NDP pull the plug on this supply and confidence agreement? I mean, I just look at it from a 30,000-foot level and say this is a change election, and they are positioned on the side of continuity. How do they get from there to the change side of the equation?
Well, at the risk of poking the bear, I'll make some comparisons back to the Layton period. Layton campaigned and actually showed progress.
Am I the bear?
Yeah. Over a series, quick cycle of elections. Then he pulled the pin on childcare, and then the NDP was responsible for not having childcare. That was the thing. But I don't think that Layton suffered a ton from that because it showed he was prepared to play in the majors. For Jagmeet Singh, it's a bit of a different situation. He's not in a position to make a credible claim that he's on a rise. He's not going to get election very quickly, so he can't have that constant cycle, repeat, rinse, and so forth that Layton had. So, it's very, very difficult. I mean, the challenge for the Green Party here in BC, which is a similar one for Jagmeet, is to not appear to be phony on an issue that you really care about. So I think that for the Greens, climate change was that issue. Their leader, Andrew Weaver, is allegedly, not allegedly, he was part of a Nobel Prize winning team. So when he said the Green Plan is okay, then everybody says, well, it must be okay if Weaver likes it. The NDP is heading for that territory now with pharmacare because arguably many of the other issues that they might pull the pin over are not crucial for them. I think in pharmacare, it's a health issue. It's an NDP issue. They say we really, really, really have to have it. So if they don't...
Honest to God, though, there aren't 50 votes in that issue in the country, Geoff.
But it's not whether people care about pharmacare. It's whether they think you're a phony.
Authentic.
And I think that's the bigger question.
All right. Well, speaking of health-related issues, I want to just touch on an issue that I don't understand very much, and I'm hoping you can educate me about. When I do national polling, the issue of opioids, addictions, and crime pop in BC in a way they don't in the rest of the country. They turn up unaided and open-ended questions in a way that they don't in the rest of the country. Mike, what's going on?
Well, I'm at sea on this as well. I mean, it's a really complicated issue, but clearly the number of opioid deaths is it's a crisis. We always say that. It's almost, we made that routine that we're in a perpetual crisis on this issue with fentanyl addiction and disproportionately high younger males dying, I believe, at a much higher rate than we ever saw from deaths from COVID. And the other manifestations of that are you can see on the streets. It's not just Vancouver, which Vancouver I would argue is a pretty gritty street scene right now. But Nanaimo has a profound problem. Victoria has a profound problem. Prince George, Kamloops, you name it. And then we see it, down West Coast cities as well. Portland's got a very dramatic problem right now. Seattle, San Francisco, so on and so on. So this is not an easy fix. Where I think average voters are frustrated. And there was a story this week on London Drugs expressing its frustration with the amount of impact it's having on its stores, its threats to its staff, its shoplifting, the abuse of
deterrence
behavior.
Of regular traffic, probably.
Yeah, and it's a hard thing, and I think people are frustrated. And this is the type of issue that could, be a problem for the provincial government, and I think the premier's moving on a few fronts here, but it doesn't feel like any progress is being made, quite frankly. And it comes down, there's treatment involved, there's mental health involved, there's policing involved, it's the courts, it's the whole cocktail, and it's all those things that make it really hard to actually do anything because there's so many people, so many players involved. So yeah, I don't. I'm just communicating how confusing it is and how bad it is, and without knowing exactly what I would do if I were in power.
Kate, is the big argument about treatment versus criminality?
I think it is. I think it is in BC. I mean, that said, I wonder how much how much space there is for provincial governments to lead on the treatment piece. It's a bit like housing again, where you're caught a little bit in how much you can find proof points and things that tangibly people will see as helping, and the big investments you need to actually really meaningfully move the needle. It's interesting, like just to where you started with this question of how it comes unprompted when you're talking to people in BC. It's interesting for me as someone who, I'm about 4 years out from moving from Toronto to Vancouver. I actually have volunteered in and been on a few boards related to safe injection sites and community health centers. And so I've been around it for a long time. The West Coast is different, I think, in two key ways that kind of conflict. So I'd say one is that, again, like on the kind of policy think tank point that I made earlier, again, like where Insight started, we have led on harm reduction. And I'd say generally there's sort of a broader and stronger understanding of the importance of that work here. And this is something I think symptomatic. It's not a BC specific thing so much as a West Coast of North America thing, where I think for a bunch of reasons, there's just a bit more the sort of implications for sort of street safety. There's a bit more of a presence on sort of commercial strips and downtowns that, going back to the London drugs example, they were raising some really serious concerns about staff. They were talking about staff being attacked with a hatchet. There can be really serious implications.
For minimum wage.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, let's talk about who we're talking about, largely women and immigrants working in these shops downtown for minimum wage, facing daily really stressful scenarios. And again, I'm not someone who sort of I always get a bit uncomfortable when we lead with the people who are uncomfortable around it, because there's a whole story about it. But I think we also have to recognize it's reached a point where it's really serious on that end. And I think for London Drugs, again, such a kind of strong BC brand to be the ones to raise the concern on this tells you how much this is an issue. And it's got a bit of a background too, I'm going to say. Actually, I'm curious what Mike and Geoff might say about this, but it's got a bit of a background going back to the roots of the sort of argument about Surrey and the RCMP and a local police force, right? There's been a lingering issue here related to, I'd say, the opioid crisis and drugs and gangs that's been burbling for a while, with people feeling uncomfortable and not safe. And so it's interesting, like the policy space is not wide on this, and then you've got these tensions with a sort of like a real embrace on harm reduction. That's really hard to fund and actually do, and then people are genuinely struggling, feeling unsafe in downtown strips, major downtown strips.
Geoff, you talked earlier about how people are in a mood for common sense solutions. And how does that play into this issue? Because I don't think that safe injection sites are a common sense solution for most people. Maybe they've become so in British Columbia, but I think Poilievre's talk sounds more like common sense to people.
Well, I agree, and I've been involved in different ways in this as long as my colleagues have, but it's now the leading cause of death in key demographics, not all demographics. And we had the first big fentanyl problem in North America, in BC, and we have the worst. So we've been leading, unfortunately, in that demographic. And we declared it an emergency a long time ago now, a number of years ago, 2016, I think it was. And it's continually gotten worse in spite of all of the priorities that two different governments have put on it. So the question then has to arise is this a problem? It's not a problem for the people who are suffering from addiction or substance abuse disorders, because that can happen or not happen to two people who have very similar circumstances. Why is our society more vulnerable? And other societies are too, but why is BC particularly vulnerable to this? And to get back to the common sense thing, I think that's where in the political sphere, you see the decriminalization that was done as a pilot program with collaboration with the federal government, hitting a wall in terms of a lot of the disorder, and David Eby quickly shifting gears, although he was all in favor of decriminalization, as was I, as was the whole government, as was all of the kind of leading opinion leaders in the province. And he's saying, no, there has to be some new changes so that people don't have to take a chance going to the playground that people are going to be using in the playground. And I think that he was challenged by the head of the press gallery, the dean of the press gallery, Vaughn Palmer, who said to him, a lot of your old activist friends, they don't recognize you anymore, that you've changed. He said that they're right. which I thought was shrewd and kind of goes to your populist point, David. He just goes, I've been living in the real world for quite a bit longer now, and I see some different solutions need to be taken on here. He's done that on 2 or 3 occasions. But on this drug issue, it's a profoundly challenging one for the province of BC because every month we have our coroner roll out new numbers, which almost never improve, about how many British Columbians are dying as a result. Now, will it change the result of the election? It's there with pharmacare and a bunch of other things. A lot of people would love to have it fixed. That's not what they roll out of bed in the morning thinking about. They're probably more concerned about gas prices, but still, it's a profoundly moral problem, which politics has not come up with an answer for. And that's where Rustad and those guys are really starting to make some hay. They just say, hey, cut the BS and stop coddling people and provide more treatment. Nobody disagrees with treatment. Nobody knows what it is, but nobody disagrees with it.
So let me be super crass and cynical. If this was a problem that was simply isolated to the people that are using and the hangers-on around that in certain neighborhoods, it would be a modest political issue and most people would not care about it very much. It's the fact that it has spilled out into the places where regular people go and it's inconveniencing them or scaring them or bothering them to see it. That's when it becomes an issue. So it's in the midst of our society now. Am I right about that? Do you think?
It's definitely more visible. I mean, I think the problem has been in place for quite some time, going back more than 20 years in some respect, right? I mean, downtown East Side has had profound issues for a long time, but it's at another level now. And I think, yes, there is more direct experience people are having with the issue in terms of what they see. And for some communities, it is relatively new, like Nanaimo or other mid-sized cities, which are seeing, entrenched camps that are causing lots of issues. But it's also the anecdotal information that flows from these situations, such as, a guy that goes in to get his tools back from a camp, he knows that are stolen, he gets stabbed, or the person, the addict who's been arrested 100 times and gets released every time back onto the street. I think that drives people crazy. And there's got to be a better solution than that. So it's not just that they see it, it's just what they hear about it as well. And it doesn't feel like government's got a grip on it of all levels.
Right. All right. So let's give folks a look forward to the podcast. I want to ask each of you, what is the thing you're most looking forward to following and talking about over the course of the next months now that we've got this podcast going? Geoff, what is really interesting you in politics right now?
Well, I don't think we've ever seen such an uproar in terms of the political scene with 4 parties in the House, all of which have some chance of growing or sliding. And we're seeing a generational renewal, but less so on the BC United front. And so a huge challenge for Kevin Falcon is to demonstrate that new fresh face for the province. And then he's trying to do it while playing defense against John Rustad, who's checking into whether the United Nations would take over the province with this new piece of legislation. So, I think it can't get any better than this. And I hope that 99 is not the floor. It's just, or not the ceiling, just the floor. 99.
Kate, what about you? What's animating you right now in terms of BC politics?
Well, I'm actually still just enjoying living in a place where we are this sort of funny policy think tank. I am still fascinated by the way we lead on harm reduction policy, don't have fluoride in our water, incubate ideas like the $10 a day childcare plan. So for me, it's a little bit, I'm really enjoying being this sort of parachuted in outsider looking at this really interesting province. And I think, again, BC continues to be poised, particularly on files like climate and I'm going to name these two. I'm going to say climate and the opioid crisis, maybe housing as a third, to be a leader. And what other big files are there right now? So I think we're just going to be, I'm going to call it BC's the province to watch.
If you don't have fluoride in the water, you need good dental policy.
Totally.
Dental care should be big out in BC. Mike, What are you looking forward to talking about on the show?
Well, the case point, we also brought one of your favorite policies to Canada, David, which is fixed election days. So don't forget about that one either. I'm looking forward to the conversations. I think we're going to bring on some really smart people onto the pod. People that have been behind the curtain or maybe in front of the curtain. So I'm looking forward to having that dialogue from all directions across the spectrum. I think that's going to be great. And I also think it feels to me like BC's at a moment where there's going to be another explosion on the free enterprise side. We've had these big moments, 1952, 1975, 1991. And that 1991 era is basically over now for the BC Liberals. Well, it's definitely over. So what's next? And will it be settled in the run-up to this election or after? Remains to be seen. But we're definitely in a period of reformulation to some degree, and that will play out in the next 6 to 12 months.
Super interesting. Thank you for this conversation. Had so much fun and learned so much talking with you all today. Good luck on your podcast. I'm very excited to listen to it and watch it go. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN Rail today. Everybody who watched or listened, sign up. Hit the subscribe button for Hotel Pacifico, your window onto BC politics. You guys, good luck. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, David. We hope you'll be. We'll hope you'll be a guest at the Hotel Pacifico at some point.
idea.
Anytime. Right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.